Picture a merchant ship cutting through dark water toward the port of Ugarit, one of the richest trading cities in the ancient world. It's carrying amphorae of wine from Crete, copper ingots from Cyprus, purple dye worth more than gold. The crew's exhausted but excited. They've been at sea for weeks and they can finally see the coast of Syria ahead. Except something's wrong. There's smoke on the horizon. Not the usual cooking fires or temple incense. This is different. As they get closer, the crew realizes they're looking at columns of black smoke rising from where the city should be. The great harbour that's welcomed ships for centuries is filled with wreckage. Bodies float in the water, and when they finally reach the shore, they find that Ugarit, a city that had stood for over 1,000 years, has been completely destroyed. The palace is burning. The temples are rubble. The streets are full of the dead. And the strangest part? Nobody knows who did this or why. This actually happened around 1177 BC, and Ugarit wasn't alone. Within a span of just a few decades, virtually every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean collapsed. The Hittite Empire, which had ruled Anatolia for centuries, vanished so completely that people forgot it ever existed until archaeologists rediscovered it 3,000 years later. Mycenaean Greece, the world of Agamemnon and the heroes who supposedly fought at Troy, imploded. Their massive palaces were burned and abandoned. Egypt, the most stable civilization on earth, barely survived. The pharaohs managed to hold on, but the glorious new kingdom was shattered, never to recover its former power. The Kassite dynasty in Babylon fell. The great trading cities along the coast of Syria and Palestine were destroyed and never rebuilt. In the span of a single human lifetime, the entire interconnected world of the Bronze Age came crashing down. This wasn't one empire conquering another. This was something far stranger, more total, more mysterious. It was systemic collapse on a scale that historians still struggle to explain. Because here's the thing, there's no single cause that fits. No one enemy that can take the credit. No simple explanation that accounts for why everything fell apart at once. Some blame the Sea Peoples, mysterious raiders whose origins nobody can agree on. Others point to earthquakes, droughts, famines. Some argue it was internal rebellion, the collapse of palace economies that had grown too rigid to adapt. And the really unsettling part, they're probably all right. It wasn't one disaster, it was everything at once. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So subscribe maybe, and if you're curious about even deeper prehistoric mysteries, we've put together a book about secrets from before recorded history at sleepytimehistory.com. You know that feeling when you realise something that seemed permanent was actually fragile all along? That's what 1177 BC teaches us. The Bronze Age civilizations looked invincible, and then suddenly they weren't. Before we can understand how everything collapsed, we need to understand what was there to collapse in the first place. Because the late Bronze Age, roughly 1500 to 1200 BC, wasn't some primitive world of isolated kingdoms scratching out survival. This was one of the first great ages of globalization, an interconnected network of civilizations spanning thousands of miles, linked by trade routes, diplomatic marriages, and treaties that would make modern international relations look simple by comparison. Let's start in Egypt. The New Kingdom was at its absolute peak. Rameses II, Rameses the Great, ruled for 66 years and left monuments so massive that they still dominate the landscape today. Abu Simbel, the Ramesseum, countless temples and statues carved with hieroglyphs declaring Egyptian supremacy over the known world. Egypt controlled territory from Nubia in the south, all the way up through the Levant. Their grain stores could feed millions. Their gold mines in Nubia produced wealth that made them the financial center of the Bronze Age world. And they knew it. Egyptian correspondence from this period has the tone of a superpower that's never seriously doubted its own dominance. To the north in Anatolia, the Hittite Empire controlled a territory larger than modern Turkey. Their capital, Hattusa, had massive stone walls, elaborate temples, and archives containing thousands of clay tablets documenting everything from military campaigns to bread distribution. The Hittites were master diplomats and warriors. They fought Egypt to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh, one of the largest chariot battles in ancient history, then negotiated what might be the world's first formal peace treaty. It's written in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform, and you can see copies of it at the United Nations today. Across the Aegean, Mycenaean Greece was flourishing. Not the classical Greece of philosophy and democracy that was still 800 years in the future. This was the Greece of massive stone palaces, warrior kings, and elaborate burial chambers filled with gold death masks. Places like Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos weren't just fortresses. They were sophisticated administrative centres with literate bureaucracies managing complex economies. Linear B tablets, the earliest form of written Greek, show meticulous records of everything from chariot wheels in storage to quantities of perfumed oil. These palace complexes controlled vast territories, coordinated labour forces of thousands, and maintained trade networks that stretched from Italy to the Near East. Further east, the Assyrians and Babylonians controlled Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers where civilization had first emerged thousands of years earlier. They had libraries, law codes, astronomical observations, and mathematical systems sophisticated enough that we still use their base 60 counting for time and angles. And along the coast of the Levant, wealthy city-states like Ugarit, Byblos, and Tyre served as crucial trading hubs, where goods and ideas from 3 continents came together. But here's what makes this period truly remarkable. These civilizations weren't just existing alongside each other. They were constantly communicating, trading, negotiating, and yes, sometimes fighting, but always within a shared framework of international relations. The Amarna letters prove this beyond any doubt. These are clay tablets discovered in Egypt, correspondence between pharaohs and other rulers, and the tone is shockingly familiar. Kings address each other as brother. They exchange elaborate gifts, gold statues, lapis lazuli, expensive textiles. They complain when gifts aren't generous enough. They request each other's daughters in marriage and negotiate the bride price like businessmen hammering out a merger. One letter has a Babylonian king essentially nagging the pharaoh about a shipment of gold that's late. Another has a Cypriot ruler apologizing because he can't send more copper due to a plague outbreak. These aren't primitive warlords. These are sophisticated statesmen managing complex diplomatic relationships across thousands of miles. And the trade networks, they were absolutely staggering in scope. Tin, which was essential for making bronze, came from as far away as Afghanistan, and possibly even Cornwall in Britain. Copper came primarily from Cyprus, which was basically the Bronze Age equivalent of an oil-rich Gulf state. Baltic amber made its way south through Central Europe into the Mediterranean. Ivory from Africa, incense from Arabia, purple dye from Phoenician cities, grain from Egypt, wine from Crete, olive oil from Greece. All of this was flowing constantly through interconnected routes maintained by merchants who knew how to navigate both seas and diplomatic protocols. Archaeological sites from this period show goods from wildly distant places ending up together. A shipwreck off the coast of Turkey, the Uluburun wreck, contained copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, amber from the Baltic, ebony from Africa, glass beads from Mesopotamia, and pottery from at least 7 different regions. This was a single merchant ship carrying a snapshot of the entire late Bronze Age trade network. These weren't primitive civilizations. They had writing, mathematics, astronomy, complex legal systems, standing armies with standardized equipment, diplomatic protocols, international trade agreements. Some cities had drainage systems and paved streets. Palaces had sophisticated storage facilities for managing surplus. Scribes kept detailed records of everything from grain deliveries to religious festivals. This was a literate, bureaucratic, militarily advanced world that had been stable for centuries. And then, sometime around 1200 BC, it all came apart. Here's what you need to understand about bronze. It's not just one metal, it's an alloy, a mixture of copper and tin, and that simple fact created the entire structure of Bronze Age civilization. Because copper by itself is too soft for serious weapons or tools. You can make decorative items, basic implements, but try to forge a sword from pure copper and it'll bend the first time you hit something. Add tin though, about 10 to 15%, and suddenly you have something revolutionary. A metal that's hard enough to hold an edge, strong enough to make weapons that can actually kill people, durable enough for tools that won't break after a few uses. Bronze was the steel of its age, the material that separated advanced civilizations from everyone else. But here's the problem. Copper deposits are relatively common. Cyprus had massive copper mines. So did parts of Anatolia and the Sinai. But tin is rare. Frustratingly rare. The major tin sources were in places like Afghanistan, possibly Cornwall in Britain, maybe parts of Central Asia. We're talking thousands of miles from the major Bronze Age civilizations. No single kingdom, no matter how powerful, had easy access to both copper and tin in the quantities needed to sustain a Bronze Age economy. This wasn't a luxury goods problem. This wasn't like trading for ivory or purple dye, nice to have but not essential. Bronze was the foundation of military power, agricultural productivity, and economic development. You couldn't maintain an army without bronze weapons. You couldn't keep your agricultural economy running without bronze tools. You couldn't assert your power as a civilization without the ability to produce bronze on an industrial scale. So international trade wasn't optional. It wasn't something kingdoms engaged in when they felt like it. It was a structural necessity. The entire system required constant, reliable flow of materials across vast distances. Think about what this means. Egypt needed tin from Afghanistan just to keep their army equipped. The Hittites needed copper from Cyprus to maintain their military superiority in Anatolia. Mycenaean Greece needed both copper and tin from outside their territories. Every major civilization was dependent on trade networks they didn't fully control, moving materials through territories they didn't own, relying on relationships with distant peoples they barely understood. We know exactly how extensive these networks were because of an extraordinary archaeological discovery. In 1982, a sponge diver off the coast of Uluburun in southern Turkey spotted something on the seafloor. It turned out to be a shipwreck, a merchant vessel that sank sometime around 1300 BC. And when archaeologists finally excavated it, they found something that perfectly captures the interconnected nature of Bronze Age civilization. The cargo was insane. 10 tons of copper ingots from Cyprus, each one cast in a distinctive shape like an animal hide with handles. About a ton of tin, probably from Afghanistan, though the exact source is still debated. Glass beads from Mesopotamia, Canaanite jewellery, Egyptian scarabs, those carved beetle amulets that were everywhere in the ancient world, Mycenaean pottery, African ebony, Baltic amber, which means this ship was carrying materials that had travelled from the northern edge of Europe down through the Mediterranean. Pomegranates, figs, olives, weapons, tools, raw materials and finished goods from at least 7 different cultural regions, all packed into a single merchant vessel about 50 feet long. This wasn't some exceptional diplomatic gift shipment. This was just commerce, standard Bronze Age trade, one ship, carrying the products of an entire world. And this ship was probably one of hundreds, maybe thousands, making similar journeys every year, moving copper from Cyprus to Greece, tin from the east to the west, finished goods bouncing between ports, a constant circulation of materials that kept the whole system running. But here's where it gets terrifying. This kind of interconnectedness creates what systems theorists call tight coupling. Every part of the system depends on every other part. When everything's working, it's incredibly efficient. You get specialization, economies of scale, sophisticated production chains. Cyprus can focus on copper mining because they know they can trade for tin. Afghanistan can export tin because they know there's demand thousands of miles away. Egyptian grain feeds populations across the Mediterranean. Mycenaean pottery ends up in Hittite palaces. Everyone benefits from everyone else's specialization, until something breaks. Because in a tightly coupled system, a failure in one part can cascade through the entire network. It's not like earlier periods when civilizations were relatively self-sufficient. A drought in Mesopotamia was a Mesopotamian problem. A war in Anatolia stayed in Anatolia. But by the late Bronze Age, everything was connected. A disruption in the tin supply from Afghanistan wouldn't just affect Afghanistan. It would ripple across the entire Mediterranean. Civilizations would suddenly find themselves unable to produce bronze. Armies would lose their equipment. Agricultural productivity would decline. Economic systems would start failing. You can see the parallels to modern global supply chains. That moment during the pandemic when a single shipping bottleneck could create shortages everywhere. When a chip factory in Taiwan affects car production in Detroit. When a crisis in one country's wheat production sends food prices soaring on the other side of the world. We've built a system of extraordinary efficiency that's also extraordinarily fragile. And the Bronze Age was the first time in human history that we created something similar. The Olubaran shipwreck is beautiful in a way. It's proof that ancient peoples were capable of maintaining these vast networks, that they could coordinate trade across thousands of miles, navigate dangerous seas, manage complex logistics, and keep goods flowing year after year for centuries. But it's also a warning frozen in time, because that ship sank, and with it, 10 tons of copper and a ton of tin vanished into the Mediterranean. Multiply that loss by dozens of ships going down. Add disruptions to trade routes from warfare. Factor in production failures from drought or disease. Imagine what happens when the Cypriot copper mines slow down just as tin shipments from the east are disrupted. Suddenly you don't have isolated problems. You have a systems crisis. The very interconnectedness that made Bronze Age civilization so successful becomes the mechanism of its destruction. When the web held together, it held everything together. But when it started to tear, there was nothing to stop the entire thing from unraveling at once. They came from the sea. That's what the Egyptian records say. They came in ships, in numbers beyond counting, and they destroyed everything they touched. The Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples, a name that tells us almost nothing except the direction they arrived from. And more than 3,000 years later, we still don't really know who they were. You can see them carved into the temple walls at Medinet Habu. Rameses III commissioned these reliefs to commemorate his victories, and they're some of the most dramatic images from the ancient world. Ships locked in naval combat, warriors with distinctive feathered headdresses, battle scenes showing Egyptian forces fighting off invaders, and next to these images, inscriptions that read like something out of a nightmare. No land could stand before their arms, from Hatti, Kode, Carchemish, Arzawa, and Alashia on, being cut off at one time. A camp was set up in Amuru. They desolated its people, and its land was like that which has never come into being. They were coming forward toward Egypt, while the flame was prepared before them. Think about that language. This isn't diplomatic correspondence where everyone's trying to sound reasonable. This is existential terror barely contained by royal propaganda. The flame was prepared before them, lands cut off, desolation. These are the words of someone describing not just raiders, but an apocalypse in motion. The Egyptians even recorded names: the Peliset, the Jekka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh. They listed them like they were cataloguing different tribes of demons, and scholars have been arguing ever since about who these people actually were. The Peliset might be the Philistines, the ones who show up in the Bible settling on the coast of Canaan. The Shekelesh could be from Sicily, though the linguistic evidence is thin. The Denyen might be connected to the Greeks, maybe displaced Mycenaeans looking for new homes after their own civilization collapsed. Or they could be Anatolians, or Sardinians, or some mixed confederation of survivors from multiple cultures, thrown together by desperation and held together by the basic human need to find somewhere, anywhere, to survive. Nobody agrees, and the more you dig into the scholarship, the more you realize how little we actually know. We have Egyptian propaganda claiming victory over these invaders. We have some archaeological evidence of destructions that might be connected to them. We have layers of burned cities and abandoned settlements. But connecting all of it into a coherent narrative of who these people were and what they were trying to accomplish, that's where everything gets murky. Here's what makes the Sea Peoples fascinating and frustrating and deeply relevant to understanding the collapse. We don't know if they were the cause or the symptom. Were they the ones who destroyed Bronze Age civilization, a horde of barbarian raiders who swept through the Mediterranean destroying everything in their path? Or were they themselves refugees, displaced populations fleeing from civilizations that were already crumbling, pushed into desperate migration by forces they couldn't control? Because here's the thing about the timing. The Sea Peoples show up in Egyptian records right when everything else is falling apart. The Hittite Empire is collapsing, Mycenaean Greece is burning, trade networks are breaking down, climate records show severe drought, and suddenly here come these mysterious raiders, appearing at exactly the moment when the entire system is most vulnerable. That's either the worst coincidence in history, or it tells us something important about what was really happening. The traditional story, the one Rameses III wanted you to believe, is simple. Barbarian invaders destroyed civilization. They came from outside the system, attacked the great kingdoms, and brought everything crashing down. It's a satisfying narrative. Clear cause and effect, heroes and villains, Egypt as the last bastion standing against the tide of chaos. But the more archaeologists excavate, the less sense this story makes, because the destructions don't follow a pattern of invasion. They're not moving in a clear direction like you'd expect from a military campaign. Instead, they're scattered. Some cities burn, others show evidence of abandonment without violence. Some regions experience multiple destructions over decades. Others seem to collapse from internal problems with no sign of external attack at all. And then there's Ugarit, the city we mentioned earlier, the one with all the international letters. We have the last correspondence from the king of Ugarit, written right before the city was destroyed around 1190 BC. He's pleading for help. Ships have been sighted. The enemy is coming. He's desperate. And the striking thing about these letters is that they don't read like a king facing an unexpected invasion. They read like a king who's been dealing with escalating crises for years, who's already weakened, whose kingdom is already falling apart, and who's now facing one final disaster he can't handle. The letter that survived was addressed to the king of Al-Ashir, modern Cyprus, asking for military aid. We don't know if it was ever sent. If it was, the help never came. Maybe because Cyprus had its own problems. Maybe because they couldn't spare troops. Maybe because by the time the message arrived it was already too late. Ugarit burned. The archaeological layer from 1190 BC shows a complete destruction. Bodies left in the streets, houses collapsed, the palace destroyed. Everything that made Ugarit one of the great trading cities of the Bronze Age, erased. Were the Sea Peoples responsible? Probably. The timing matches. But were they organized invaders executing a planned attack, or were they desperate migrants? Former sailors and merchants and soldiers whose own cities had already fallen now turned pirates because piracy was the only option left. The more you look at the evidence, the more it seems like the sea peoples weren't the barbarians at the gate. They were what happens when the gates fall down on their own. When trade networks collapse and cities start burning, you get displaced populations, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people with nowhere to go. Former subjects of kingdoms that no longer exist. Sailors whose trading routes have dried up. Soldiers whose commanders can't pay them anymore. These people don't just disappear. They gather into groups. They acquire ships. They go looking for resources. And in a world that's already falling apart, they become one more stressor on civilizations that are barely holding on. Not the cause of the collapse, the symptom, the visible face of a systemic failure that was already underway. Rameses III defeated the Sea Peoples, or at least that's what his inscriptions claim. He stopped them at Egypt's borders, maintained order while chaos consumed everyone else. And maybe that's partially true, but the real question isn't whether Egypt won the battle. It's why there was a battle in the first place. Why did all these people suddenly become raiders? Where did they come from? What destroyed their homes? Answer those questions and you start to understand that the Sea Peoples aren't the mystery. They're the clue. When you start pulling on that thread, you end up leaving the ships and the spears behind and looking somewhere much quieter. Not at armies, but at mud, at pollen, at the ghostly rings in ancient trees that never knew they were recording the end of an age. Because long before Rameses carved victory scenes into stone, something else seems to have gone wrong with the world itself. If you take a core of mud from the bottom of a lake, it's like slicing through time. Layer after layer, year after year, settling gently in the dark. Trapped in those layers are tiny grains of pollen from every plant that grew around the water. Wheat, barley, olives, wild scrub and desert shrubs. Count the grains in each layer and you can reconstruct what the landscape used to look like, and how it changed. Researchers like Brandon Drake and others have done exactly this across the Eastern Mediterranean, in Cyprus, in the Levant, in what used to be the grain fields of Bronze Age kingdoms. When they examine cores from around 1200 BC, the picture shifts in a way that's hard to ignore. Pollen from crops and oak forests drop sharply. Pollen from drought-tolerant plants and scrub shoots up. The landscape is thinning out. Fields are failing. The green skin over the earth is pulling back. It's the same story in different languages of evidence. Lake levels decline. In caves, stalagmites record changes in rainfall through the thickness of their layers and the chemistry of the calcite. Around the same time the palaces begin to burn, those layers tell us the skies had already started to close. Tree rings add another voice to the chorus. Trees don't care about kings. They just respond to water. Wide ring, good year. Thin ring, bad year. In places where ancient timbers survive, reused in buildings, preserved in dry climates, dendrochronology lets us line those rings up like a barcode. The sequence around 1200 BC is marked by multiple years of narrow rings, some clusters of poor growth that look suspiciously like prolonged drought. None of this proves that there was one single, perfect, region-wide mega-drought that hit every field in exactly the same year. Nature is messier than that. But when Brandon Drake mapped out pollen data from Cyprus and the Levant, he saw a pattern consistent with severe aridification spread over decades, not a bad harvest or two. A shift in climate that made farming itself more precarious. Now imagine you're not an archaeologist looking at data. Imagine you're a farmer outside Ugarit, or a Hittite peasant in central Anatolia. You don't know anything about precipitation anomalies or atmospheric circulation. You just know the rains have become unreliable. Springs are lower each year. The barley never quite fills out. The olives set less fruit. The first bad year, the palace opens its granaries. That's the whole point of a Bronze Age state. Taxes come in during the good times, grain goes out during the bad. The second bad year they open them again, but the storerooms are thinner. The third bad year, the scribes are keeping careful count. Rations are cut. People start selling land, selling children, selling themselves into debt bondage just to stay alive. And then, in some parts of the Eastern Mediterranean, at almost exactly the same time that the sky's turning against them, the ground begins to move. Geophysicist Amos Nuer has argued that the late Bronze Age collapse coincides with what he calls an earthquake storm. Not one enormous cataclysmic quake, but a sequence of major earthquakes rippling along fault lines over a span of decades. If you look at a tectonic map, the Eastern Mediterranean is a tangle of boundaries, like cracks in a broken plate. The Hellenic Arc, the Anatolian fault systems, smaller local faults under the Aegean and Levant. Stress in one place can trigger shaking in another. Archaeology seems to preserve the aftershocks in stone and mud brick. At Mycenae, the citadel that once commanded the Argive plain, there's a destruction layer around the end of the 13th century BC, where walls are tumbled in patterns that don't look like fire or siege. Stones have slid sideways off their foundations. Masonry has collapsed outward in a way that suggests sudden shaking from below, not battering from above. Tiryns, another Mycenaean fortress not far away, shows similar evidence. Cracked walls, shifted blocks, buildings pancaked in ways that match what we see in modern earthquake zones. The people who rebuilt after the damage seem to have been fewer. The architecture grows rougher. It's like watching a culture try to stand up again on a floor that won't stop trembling. Knossos on Crete had already gone through earlier destructions in the age of the Minoans, but in the late Bronze Age it too shows signs of seismic trauma. Floors buckled, column bases skewed. Not the clean, sharp burn layer of an invading army, but the chaotic mess of buildings that simply gave way. Farther east, Troy, the city of legend perched above the Dardanelles, goes through multiple destruction phases. One of the layers dating to the general period of the collapse shows walls thrown down and foundations twisted in a way that many archaeologists interpret as seismic rather than military. And then there's Ugarit again, on the Syrian coast. In some buildings there, heavy stones have fallen inwards from multiple directions. Walls lean at odd angles. It's entirely possible Ugarit experienced both human and natural catastrophe. Shaking first, fires and invaders later. When systems are already stressed, disasters rarely arrive one at a time. You don't have to accept every site on Amos Nuer's list to see the pattern he's pointing to. Across a seismically active region, within roughly a century, multiple major centers show destruction layers that line up with what we'd expect from earthquakes. Not all at once, not on the same exact day, but close enough, in historical terms, to feel like a storm rather than scattered, unrelated showers. Put the drought and the earthquakes together and the picture gets darker. Drought alone doesn't automatically end civilizations. People move, they switch crops, they reorganize. Earthquakes alone don't either. Cities get rebuilt on top of their own rubble all the time, but drought plus earthquakes plus the rigid, top-heavy political systems of the late Bronze Age? That's a different story. Start with the drought. Less rain means smaller harvests. Smaller harvests mean fewer taxes in kind for the palace. But the palace still has to feed its retainers, its soldiers, its scribes and craftsmen. It still has to fund foreign wars and pay for imported tin and luxury goods to keep the elite happy. There's less coming in and the same amount or more going out. As grain supplies tighten, prices rise. Ordinary people feel it first. Malnutrition creeps in on bare feet. Children don't grow as tall. Immune systems weaken. Diseases that would normally pass through now linger and kill. Famine doesn't arrive as an abstract concept. It arrives as fights at the ration line, as thefts in the fields, as soldiers sent to guard granaries who start to wonder why they're protecting food for other people's children while their own go hungry. Social trust erodes. Banditry becomes more common. Local officials, under pressure from above and below, start falsifying records or taking bribes to allocate scarce grain. The very structures meant to keep things stable begin to rot from the inside. Now sprinkle in earthquakes. A city that might have just barely scraped through a series of dry years suddenly has its storage jars smashed and its walls cracked. Temples collapse. Palaces are damaged. People die not from hunger this time, but from falling stone. Rebuilding requires labour and resources that are already in short supply. Timber for new roofs, stone for new walls, food to pay the workers. But the land has been stingy, and the treasury is low. Some places pull themselves back together in a simpler form. Others are abandoned, their survivors drifting towards still functioning centres and swelling the ranks of the desperate. The royal archives give us a glimpse of how this looked from the top. Among the clay tablets recovered from Hattusa, the Hittite capital, there are letters from a king, probably Tudalia IV, in the decades before the final collapse, begging Egypt for grain. Not asking politely in the language of equal partners, but pleading. The Hittite heartland was inland, more vulnerable to drought than the Nile Valley with its annual flood. When the rains failed in Anatolia, the Hittites turned to their southern neighbour, whose entire civilization was built around a river that, for the time being, still obeyed its ancient rhythms. One letter summarizes it bluntly. There is a hunger in my land. Send grain so that my people may live. This is years before the sea peoples appear in Egyptian reliefs. Long before Rameses III boasts of turning back the onslaught, the interior is already in trouble. The great Hittite Empire, which once fielded chariot armies and dictated terms to kings from Syria to western Anatolia, is reduced to asking for emergency food shipments. Egypt itself sends what it can. But even along the Nile, inscriptions from the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC hint at low floods and shortages. Grain prices spike in some records. Officials boast of feeding people during hard years. That's what rulers do when they're afraid of unrest. They remind everyone that the state, not chaos, is their lifeline. Because famine is not just a biological event, it's political. Hunger makes people question why they're obeying a king who can't keep them alive. Peasant revolts, palace coups, local strongmen carving out territories of their own. All of these become more likely when there isn't enough to eat. And weakened states are bad at two crucial things: diplomacy and defence. When your administration is busy triaging food supplies, it's harder to maintain far-flung trade networks. When your soldiers are needed to guard storage depots, it's harder to send them to the borders. When your treasury is emptied buying grain, it's harder to pay for chariot horses or imported weapons. So when displaced peoples begin to move, some of them eventually becoming what Egypt will call the Sea Peoples, they're not moving into a stable, well-fed, well-defended world. They're moving into a landscape of shaken palaces, hungry populations, and rulers already on the edge of losing control. From the mud and the pollen and the broken stones, a quiet picture emerges. Before the flames, before the ships, nature itself seems to have turned hostile. The climate tightened its grip. The earth shifted underfoot. The great kingdoms of the Bronze Age didn't face one single enemy. They faced a world that was becoming less forgiving, exactly when their own systems were least capable of bending. And inside those systems, another problem was growing, not in the clouds or the fault lines, but in the way power and wealth were arranged. Not the ruins we know now, bare stone under the sun, but the living buildings as they were, storerooms stacked with jars of oil and wine, granaries filled with grain measured out by the handful, workshops where bronze was poured, cloth was woven, chariots were built and repaired, corridors echoing with scribes reading lists out loud as they pressed damp clay with their styluses. This was the beating heart of the late Bronze Age, the palace economy. In most of these kingdoms, Mycenaean Greece, Minoan Crete, the Hittites, the cities of Syria and Canaan, the palace was not just where the king slept. It was the centre of production, storage, redistribution, and long-distance trade. Farmers brought in grain, wool, and livestock as taxes. Craftsmen worked for rations within palace workshops. Traders sailed out with palace-owned goods and came back with copper, tin, ivory, and luxury items that went straight into royal storerooms. On a good day, it was an elegant machine. Central planning before spreadsheets. The palace collected what the countryside produced, kept careful accounts, and then sent those resources back out as wages, rations, diplomatic gifts, and offerings to the gods. In theory, everyone was tied into a single, coordinated system. Nobody outside the elite was rich, but if the records are accurate, many people at least knew where their next ration would come from. In practice, it created a world balanced on the head of a pin. Because the more this system concentrated resources in a single node, the palace, the more everything depended on that node functioning perfectly. If the harvest was bad, the palace had to dip into its reserves. If trade was disrupted, the palace had to find other ways to get metal and grain. If a king died without a clear heir, or if a key city went up in flames, the shock rippled through the whole network. Centralization brought efficiency. It also brought fragility, and it brought inequality. The same Linear B tablets that record allocations of grain and oil also hint at a stark divide between those who moved within palace walls and those who worked outside them. High officials and aristocrats at Mycenae or Pylos received land, slaves, and generous rations. They hunted, feasted, commissioned fine pottery and perfumed oils. The palace sponsored chariot parades and religious festivals. It was a world of gold cups and inlaid daggers, of frescoes showing dancers and warriors, of storerooms filled with exotic goods from hundreds of miles away. For the peasant families who actually grew the grain and raised the sheep, the picture looks different. They appear in the records as numbers. So many men, so many women, so many children, assigned to fields or flocks. Their obligations were heavy. Produce had to be handed over as tax. Time had to be given as corvée. Forced labour on royal projects, road building, fortress repair, seasonal work in palace fields. When the climate turned harsher and harvest shrank, those demands did not automatically shrink with them. In times of plenty, people could tolerate the burden. The palace provided security, storage against bad years, protection from raiders. The king was the one who appeased the gods and kept cosmic order. His wealth, though vast, could be justified as necessary for the functioning of the whole. But as drought stretched on, as earthquakes cracked walls and toppled storehouses, that bargain began to fray. From the top, the response was predictable: tighten control. In the last decades before the Mycenaean palaces burned, the tablets show an administration that feels nervous. At Pylos in western Greece, scribes recorded the mobilization of coastal watchers stationed all along the shore. There are lists of rowers, chariots, weapons, hurried inventories that read like a government suddenly aware that it might not be safe. Some tablets were still drying when the palace was destroyed. Their clay was fired not in the kiln, but in the heat of the blaze that brought the building down. Whatever emergency they were responding to, it arrived quickly. The reason for the mobilization is not written out. The tablets never say sea peoples or rebellion or famine, but the tone has shifted from the calm bookkeeping of a confident regime to the anxious scrawl of an administration trying to plug leaks in a dam. Elsewhere, we don't have such detailed archives, but we do have hints. In Egypt, a few decades later, Rameses III boasts that he fed the hungry and prevented the poor from plundering each other's houses. The fact that he needed to say that suggests how close things came to unravelling. In Ugarit, letters talk about bandits in the countryside, local unrest, officials unable to keep roads safe. In Hatti, some texts speak of vassals wavering in their loyalty, of regions not sending in the tribute they owed. Under stress, highly centralised systems often react by demanding more from the bottom to preserve the top. Higher taxes, stricter labour obligations, less tolerance for local autonomy. But there's a point where that strategy flips from stabilising to destabilising. Imagine you're that Hittite farmer again, living through poor harvest after poor harvest. You're already giving up a portion of your grain as tax. You're already sending your sons to work on royal building projects. Now the officials arrive and insist that the quota must be met, even though your fields yielded half what they did 10 years ago. You see grain being moved along royal roads to distant cities, while your neighbours scrape the bottom of their jars. The palace's warehouses are guarded, access is restricted, every handful counted. At what point do you simply walk away? Archaeology gives us a strange, quiet clue. In some regions, we don't see every settlement burned. Instead, we find large, elaborate sites abandoned or drastically reduced, while smaller villages in the hills and backcountry continue, sometimes even grow. Fortified centres go dark. Humble farmsteads keep leaving their simple pottery in the ground. There are also destruction layers that don't look like classic sieges. No piles of arrowheads, no obvious breach points, just signs of sudden burning in administrative quarters, as if anger had been directed very specifically at the symbols of authority. It's not hard to picture what that might mean. Officials who came to collect tax meeting resistance instead. Local leaders deciding that obedience to a distant king was no longer worth the cost. Townspeople turning on storerooms and archives in moments of panic or rage, destroying the very records that had defined them as owing anything at all. Some scholars have suggested that part of the Late Bronze Age collapse was, in a sense, a withdrawal of consent, that at least in some places, ordinary people stopped propping up a system that no longer protected them. Maybe they didn't plan a revolution in the modern sense. Maybe they just drifted away to the hills, or refused a summons, or quietly withheld support when raiders appeared on the horizon. When multiple stresses hit at once, drought, earthquakes, foreign raids, dynastic struggles. This erosion of internal loyalty could turn crises into catastrophe. A palace economy relies not just on grain and bronze, but on belief. Belief that the king's scribes have the right to tally your harvest. Belief that the system will look after you when the gods are angry. Once that belief is gone, the palace is just a large, vulnerable building full of things other people might want. And here is where the story bends in a way that's easy to miss if we only look from the top down. For kings and courtiers, the end of the palace world was a disaster. Titles vanished, diplomatic networks evaporated, luxuries that depended on long-distance trade. Lapis from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, tin from who knows where, became rare or disappeared altogether. Monumental architecture ceased. Writing systems in places like Greece simply stopped being used for centuries. But for some people, collapse may have felt like release. Without the palace demanding fixed quotas, farmers could keep more of what they grew, even if that more was less than it had been in the good years. Without corvée labour, whole seasons might open up to work their own land. Villages could govern themselves with local customs instead of distant edicts. Trade didn't vanish. It shrank and became more local, more flexible, less dominated by royal monopolies. Archaeologists call the centuries after the collapse Dark Ages because the big, bright centres are gone and the written records with them. From the point of view of a scribe or a diplomat, that's true. The archives go silent. But in the soil of those same centuries we find continuity. Fields still ploughed, simple houses still built, new pottery styles emerging, small sanctuaries beside springs and on hilltops where local communities made offerings without needing a great king's permission. The palace economies of the Late Bronze Age were astonishing achievements. They coordinated resources across huge distances, turned copper and tin into weapons and tools, fed standing armies and priestly colleges. They also concentrated power and wealth so tightly that when the world around them grew harsher, there was little slack left in the system. Inequality deepened. Trust thinned. And in that narrowing space between expectation and reality, between obligation and survival, something started to give way. By the time drought and earthquakes and strange ships appeared on the horizon, many of these societies were already hollowing out from within. The walls still stood. The storerooms were still full, at least in some places. The scribes were still writing. But the web of loyalty, obligation, and belief that held everything together was fraying. And once that web snapped in one major kingdom, the shock didn't stay contained. In the next part of the story, we follow one of those kingdoms, the Hittite Empire, as it moves from the height of its power to complete erasure in what feels like the span of a single, shuddering breath. The Hittites called their land Hatti, and for a time it was one of the great pillars holding up the Late Bronze Age world. If you had stood in Egypt around 1250 BC and asked a royal scribe to list the major powers of the earth, the answer would have been almost automatic: Egypt, Babylonia, Assyria, and Hatti. The Hittite king was not a distant barbarian chieftain. He was a peer, a man you addressed as brother in diplomatic letters, who sent and received princesses in marriage alliances, who traded gold and grain and gods with you. And yet a few centuries later, if you had asked a Greek traveller about the Hittites, you would have gotten only a blank look. They were gone. Not just defeated, not just shrunken, but erased so thoroughly that nobody even remembered their name. For more than 2,000 years, the Hittite Empire existed only as a faint echo in the Old Testament phrase, the land of the Hittites, a term even ancient readers didn't fully understand. Their capital, Hattusa, slept under fields and scrubland in central Anatolia. Its walls tumbled, its archives buried, its gods forgotten. To see why their disappearance still puzzles historians, you have to picture the city at its height. Hattusa sat high on a rocky plateau, surrounded by massive stone fortifications that snaked across the hills in great arcs. In places the walls rose in multiple lines, with towers and gates faced in carefully cut blocks, each stone fitted into the next like a puzzle. There were gates crowned with lions and sphinxes, processional ways lined with carved reliefs of soldiers, priests and deities. Inside the walls, temples dedicated to the storm god and sun goddess dominated the city, surrounded by storage rooms and courtyards, workshops and residences. And beneath all of this, in cool magazine rooms and palace archives, lay thousands upon thousands of clay tablets. Letters from foreign kings written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the day. Ritual text in Hittite, prescribing offerings and incantations for every imaginable crisis. Legal codes, oaths, treaties, inventories of grain and livestock, prayers, myths. When archaeologists finally uncovered those tablets in the 20th century and learned to read them, a lost empire began to speak again. It told a story of rise and fall that feels eerily familiar. Like many late Bronze Age states, the Hittite kingdom had not always been an empire. It grew from a core territory in central Anatolia, conquering neighbours, absorbing city-states, weaving a patchwork of vassal princes and subject peoples into a single political fabric. At its peak, it controlled much of what is now Turkey and northern Syria, pressing right up against Egyptian interests in the south. At Kadesh, on the Orontes River, Hittite and Egyptian armies clashed in one of the largest chariot battles in history. The result was ambiguous enough that neither side could claim a clear, crushing victory. So they did something unprecedented. They made peace. The Treaty of Kadesh, carved on temple walls in Egypt and preserved on a silver tablet in Hatti, is the oldest known international peace treaty whose text we can still read. It spells out mutual defense obligations, extradition clauses, oaths before the gods. It is legalistic, careful, almost modern in its detail. Here was a state sophisticated enough to invent formal diplomacy as we recognize it. A state whose scribes could negotiate in complex legal formulas, whose kings could imagine a world where enemies became partners. And behind those diplomatic achievements was another breakthrough. Iron. Long before iron replaced bronze as the everyday metal of tools and weapons, the Hittites seem to have experimented with smelting and working this difficult material. Iron objects in Hittite contexts are rare and precious, often with ritual or prestige functions. But the know-how was there, in the hands of Anatolian smiths. On paper, this should have been an advantage, a superpower with diplomatic sophistication and early access to a transformative technology, a kingdom that had weathered wars and dynastic struggles before, a people whose archives record detailed treaties tying their vassals to them with elaborate oaths. None of it was enough. In the last century of the empire, the tablets from Hattusa and its surrounding cities begin to sound strained. We see succession disputes, brothers and cousins vying for the throne, factions forming. Each new king has to shore up loyalty with new oaths, new promises, new distributions of land and titles. Every transition is a wobble in the system. We see vassals in Syria dragging their feet, failing to send the tribute or troops they owe. Hittite kings write sharp letters reminding them of their obligations, invoking the gods as witnesses, threatening divine and political punishment. The tone shifts from confident command to repeated pleading. We see mention of grain shipments, or rather, the lack of them. Some letters speak of famine, of grain needing to be imported from vassal states along the coast. Others complain that those shipments are late or insufficient. Central Anatolia, where Hattusa lay, was vulnerable to drought. In good years, the plateau could feed the capital and supply its armies. In bad years, it had to lean heavily on its subject territories. At the same time, enemies on the northern frontier, the Kaska peoples, highland groups in the rough country near the Black Sea, press in. For centuries the Kaska had been a thorn in Hittite sides, raiding, burning, slipping back into the forests and hills where chariots could not easily follow. In the empire's final decades, references to Kaska attacks multiply. They seem to take advantage of every moment of internal weakness, every dynastic dispute, to push further south. It's not hard to imagine the cumulative pressure. A drought year here, a Kaska raid there, a prince in Syria deciding that maybe loyalty to a distant great king isn't worth the cost, grain stores running low in Hattusa, scribble hands growing more frantic as they record emergency measures. Into this atmosphere of rising stress drops one of the most haunting documents from the late Bronze Age, a letter from the last known Hittite king, Suppiluliuma II, to the ruler of Ugarit on the Syrian coast. The tablet is broken, but the meaning is clear enough. The Hittite king is in trouble. He complains that enemy ships, perhaps belonging to the same confederations we call the Sea Peoples, have attacked his lands. He orders, or begs, the king of Ugarit to send ships and troops immediately to help defend Hatti. It is a plea from one embattled palace economy to another, both already standing in floodwater, both hoping the other can still throw a rope. We know how it ended for Ugarit. Not long after that letter, the city was destroyed. Its palaces burned, its archives baked in the same flames that toppled its walls. In the ruins, archaeologists found that letter from Hatti, never answered, still lying in a scribal room when the fire came. For the Hittite Empire, the end is even more obscure. There is no proud inscription by a conqueror boasting of Hattusa's fall, no detailed chronicle of the city's last days. What we have instead is archaeology's quiet, stubborn record. A destruction layer in Hattusa around 1180 BC. Charred beams, collapsed walls, signs of intense burning in the palace and temple districts. After the fire, there is a pause. Then, almost nothing. The city is not rebuilt as a capital. The great temples do not rise again. The bureaucracy that once filled storerooms with tablets simply disappears. In the countryside, some smaller settlements continue. Life goes on in villages, on farms, in mountain valleys. But the imperial centre, the place that gave orders, kept archives, maintained the roads and vassal networks, that vanishes. Within a generation or two, the memory of a united Hittite Empire seems to have evaporated from most people's minds. And yet, not everything was lost. In the centuries after the collapse, a scattering of small kingdoms rose in southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria, Carchemish, Malatya, Kumu, and others. Modern scholars call them Neo-Hittite states, though they never again achieved the old empire's reach. Their rulers carved inscriptions in a related language, sometimes in hieroglyphic scripts that had developed in the late imperial period. Their art shows familiar motifs: weather gods standing on mountains, lions and sphinxes, royal processions. Their gods' names echo those of old Hatti. In their fortresses and city gates, you can still feel a faint reflection of Hattusa's massive walls. These little kingdoms kept pieces of Hittite culture alive for hundreds of years at the margins of rising Assyrian power. But the great experiment, the centralized, treaty-making, iron-working empire that had once rivaled Egypt, was gone. Not gradually fading into a successor dynasty, not transforming into a different but continuous state, but dropping below the horizon of written memory. In that, the Hittites show us what collapse can really mean. Not just political defeat, not just cities burned, but a kind of quiet deletion, where an entire civilization's name and achievements can lie under the soil, unread, while the world above invents new stories and forgets the old. And as Hatti's voice went silent, another old giant on the Nile looked out at the same storms gathering on the horizon, and tried, with all its remaining strength, not to follow. Egypt had seen collapses before. The Egyptians kept long memories. They remembered times when central power had crumbled, when local warlords carved up the Nile Valley, when kings were little more than names on broken stele. In their own historical consciousness, stability was something you lost, and then painfully rebuilt. So when the crisis of 1177 BC rolled in, Egypt was not a naive empire. It was an old survivor. Even so, what was coming nearly finished it. At the centre of this last great stand is one man, Rameses III of the 20th dynasty. He came to the throne in a world already fraying at the edges. The Hittites were wobbling. Ugarit was anxious enough to write those desperate letters. Raiders and migrants were moving along the coasts. Grain shipments were faltering. Rameses III's inscriptions sometimes read like a man shouting into the wind, insisting that Egypt is still strong, still rich, still blessed by the gods, because he can feel how precarious it has become. His most famous test came from the sea. The Egyptians never called them sea peoples as a single unified group. That's a modern label stitched together from fragmentary names. But Rameses III knew that something dangerous was coming. He tells us that a coalition of foreign peoples, driven from their homelands by some earlier wave of disaster, had turned south. They came, he says, their hearts confident, with their families and ox carts and their warriors by land and by ship, overrunning cities in the Levant and moving steadily toward the Nile Delta. This wasn't just a raid. It was a migration with spears. Rameses met them in two stages. First, on land, somewhere in the northeastern approaches to the delta. At his mortuary temple of Medine Habu in western Thebes, there is a vast carved panorama of this battle, still one of the most dramatic military reliefs from the ancient world. You see ranks of Egyptian infantry, archers in their feathered headdresses, chariots rolling forward. Opposite them, the foreign warriors, men in horned helmets or feathered crowns, with distinctive round shields and long swords. Mixed among the fighters are ox carts loaded with women and children, traces of the migrating families caught in the chaos. It's a frozen moment of collision between a settled river kingdom and desperate mobile communities who had already burned their way through half the eastern Mediterranean. Rameses claims to have crushed them utterly, to have turned the battlefield into a slaughter. His scribes carve long lists of captured enemies, heaps of severed hands and gruesomely genitals as proof of victory. Whether the numbers are accurate hardly matters. What the reliefs show is a state still capable of organizing a professional army, still able to meet a crisis with more than panic. But the land battle was only half the story. The other half took place on water. The same walls at Medine Habu show a naval engagement unlike anything else preserved from the Bronze Age. Egyptian ships with high, curling prows crash into enemy vessels in a churning tangle. Archers stand on deck, drawing bows. Foreign warriors topple into the water, shields and spears spinning away. Some flail amid the waves, others are already limp. The Egyptians seem to have lured the invaders into the narrow channels of the delta, where maneuver was difficult, then hit them with archers from both banks and from ships at close range. In a sea battle without room to turn, numbers and courage mattered less than positioning and discipline. If Rameses' account is even roughly accurate, this was one of the first well-documented examples of a state deliberately shaping a battlefield to neutralize a dangerous new enemy. The result, according to the Egyptian narrative, was decisive. The surviving invaders were captured and settled as subject peoples inside Egypt. The Nile Delta, at least for the moment, held. That alone already sets Egypt apart from the Hittites and from Ugarit. When the sea peoples slammed into those states, the result was annihilation. When they hit Egypt, the result was a bloody stalemate that Egypt could just barely afford. But even as Rameses carved triumphant scenes into stone, the cost was mounting. The wars were expensive. The flood cycles of the Nile may have been less reliable than before. Foreign tribute from Canaan and Syria, once a key part of Egypt's revenue, was drying up as those regions fell out of Pharaoh's hands or into chaos. And inside the palace, the king's position was not as secure as those monumental reliefs suggest. Some 2 decades into his reign, a conspiracy formed in the royal harem. We know about it thanks to a set of trial papyri that read like a meticulous ancient true crime dossier. One of Ramesses' secondary wives, Taye, apparently wanted her son on the throne instead of the designated crown prince. She gathered supporters among palace officials, scribes, magicians, even guards. They exchanged messages, cast spells, made wax figures to harm the king, tried to recruit soldiers. The plot was exposed, and the conspirators were put on trial before a special court. The records list interrogations, confessions, sentences, suicides compelled by shame, executions, mutilations. The tone is controlled, bureaucratic, almost chilling. For a long time, historians weren't sure whether the plot had actually killed Rameses III, or whether he died naturally and the conspirators failed. Then, in the early 21st century, CT scans of his mummy revealed the truth. Beneath the elaborate wrappings, the king's throat bears a deep, clean cut, slicing down to the vertebrae. The wound would have been instantly fatal. In the linen around his neck, embalmers had tucked a protective amulet in the shape of the Eye of Horus, as if trying to heal, symbolically, what had been done. The saviour of Egypt's frontiers, the king who had stood against the sea peoples, seems to have been assassinated by his own household. If you wanted a single image for how fragile the surviving Bronze Age powers had become, you could do worse than that. A victorious pharaoh, dead not on the battlefield but behind palace walls, undone by the very elites whose power his system sustained. After Ramesses III, Egypt did not suddenly collapse. That is the other thing that makes it an exception. Instead, it sank. The later Ramessid pharaohs kept the same proud names, Ramesses IV, the Fifth, the Sixth, and so on, but the grandeur was increasingly hollow. Inscriptions still speak of offerings to the gods, of building projects, of foreign campaigns. The reality beneath those formulas looks much more strained. Foreign territories in Canaan and Syria slipped away, some lost to local dynasts, others to new powers rising in the vacuum left by the Hittites. Egyptian garrisons pulled back toward the Sinai. The broad imperial reach of the new kingdom narrowed to the core Nile Valley. Within that core, cracks spread. In the workmen's village of Deir el-Medina, where specialized artisans carved and painted the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, something unprecedented happened around the time of Ramesses III's successors. The rations stopped arriving on time. These men were not peasants. They were highly skilled state employees, paid in grain and goods from the central treasury. When deliveries failed repeatedly, they did something that, as far as our records tell us, no one had ever formalized before. They went on strike. The papyri describing this event are almost mundane in tone. The workers lay down their tools, marched to local temples, and sat there refusing to work. They complained to officials, demanded their rations, invoked their rights as servants of the king. Negotiations followed. Partial payments were made. Work resumed, stopped again, resumed. It is the first recorded labour strike in history, a small but telling sign that the bureaucracy that fed Egypt's great building machine was faltering. At the same time, tomb robberies became rampant. Valley of the King's tombs, once sealed with elaborate curses and guarded by the state, were broken into by bands of thieves. Sometimes they were poor men pushed by hunger. Sometimes they seemed to have included corrupt officials using inside information. Trials from this period record detailed interrogations. Which tomb was entered? How much gold was taken? Who melted it down? Who shared in the loot? A state that can no longer consistently protect its dead king's resting places or reliably pay the workers who build those tombs is no longer the same Egypt that raised the pyramids or sent armies to the Euphrates, and yet it did not disintegrate into nothing. Why? Part of the answer lies in the geography that had always shaped Egypt's fate. Unlike Hatti, which depended on variable rains over a broad plateau, Egypt's agriculture was tied to the Nile's annual inundation. Even in years of lower flood, the river still provided a relatively predictable strip of arable land. Famine could and did occur, but the system was less brittle than a rain-fed imperial heartland. Egypt was also cushioned by deserts. To east and west stretched arid expanses that were hard for large armies to cross. There were invasion routes, the Sinai, the coastal road through Canaan, the western oases, but they were choke points that a functioning state could defend. When the Sea Peoples came, they met not an exposed hinterland, but a bottleneck at the delta. And Egypt had something else, a deep tradition of centralized military and administrative organization. For centuries, the pharaonic court had been managing large-scale labor projects, moving grain, fielding chariot forces, recording taxes, redistributing goods. When the shock came, that machinery bent under the strain, but it did not snap outright. It could still mobilize fleets and armies, still pay at least some of its personnel, still coordinate defenses. Those advantages meant that when the same wave of crises that obliterated Ugarit and Hatti hit Egypt, the state staggered, bled and shrank, but did not fall into complete dark. Survival, though, came at a cost. In the generations after Ramesses III, Egypt turned inward. The glittering empire of the New Kingdom, the world of Thutmose III and Ramesses II, of Asiatic campaigns and tribute from foreign lands, receded into memory and propaganda. The country gradually lost its hold on Nubia to the south and on Canaan to the northeast. Local elites grew stronger. By around 1070 BC, effective central power fractured. High priests of Amun in Thebes controlled Upper Egypt. Kings at Tanis held the delta. Libyan warlords and later Nubian rulers would carve out their own spheres of influence. Foreign dynasties would sit on the throne in succession. This long, complicated era is what later historians call the Third Intermediate Period. To Egyptians living through it may simply have felt like a world where the old certainties had thinned, where there were still pharaohs and temples and festivals, but the reach of any single ruler was limited, and the glorious conquests of the past were stories carved on aging walls. Egypt had survived the great collapse of 1177 BC. But the Egypt that emerged on the other side was not the same power that had once stared down the Hittites at Kadesh. Its empire was gone. Its kings were more vulnerable. Its attention had turned from ambitious expansion to the more modest, anxious work of hanging on. And beyond its deserts and border forts, far from the Nile's dependable flood, other regions that had once traded letters and princesses with Egypt lay in ruins, or were already knitting themselves into new patterns that would define the next age. Far to the east of Egypt's deserts, beyond the shattered Hittite lands and the burned-out port of Ugarit, other worlds were also changing. The Bronze Age collapse is often told as a Mediterranean story, because that's where the texts are richest, the ruins most dramatic. But the late 2nd millennium BC was not kind to anyone. If you lift your gaze from the Nile and the Aegean and let it drift outward, you begin to see the same pattern repeating in different forms: dynasties ending, cities shrinking, trade routes fraying, new peoples moving into old spaces. The storm was wider than the sea. Take Mesopotamia. In the centuries before 1177 BC, Babylon had been ruled for generations by the Kassites, a dynasty of foreign origin who had somehow managed one of the longest continuous reigns in ancient Near Eastern history. They weren't as flashy as the earlier Hammurabi, or as expansionist as the Hittites, but they were steady. For 400 years or so, Kassite Babylon was a kind of low, humming engine of stability. They rebuilt after earlier conquests, maintained canals, copied tablets, sent letters to Egypt and Hatti, exchanged horses and princesses and gifts. Then, in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC, that long equilibrium began to shudder. Elamite armies came from the Iranian plateau pushing west. Assyria to the north, first a trading state, then an ambitious kingdom, probed southward. Internal unrest grew. Around the same broad window as the Mediterranean collapse, the Kassite dynasty fell. Babylon was sacked. Its statues of gods were carried off to Elam. Dynasties flickered in and out. Rulers with short, unfamiliar names left brief inscriptions, often emphasizing how they had restored something that had previously been destroyed. Canals cleared, temples rebuilt, cult statues brought back. Every restoration is a quiet admission that there had been a break. Yet Mesopotamia did not disappear. To the north, Assyria did something similar to what Egypt managed along the Nile. It pulled back, tightened its borders, endured. The great militarized Neo-Assyrian Empire of later centuries did not yet exist. What survived was a smaller, more cautious kingdom, clinging to its core cities along the upper Tigris, Ashur, Nineveh, a few others, sometimes dominating Babylon, sometimes being checked by it, always navigating the turbulence around them. Assyria's scribes kept writing. Its kings kept dedicating temples. The state contracted, absorbed the shock, and waited. If you drift farther east again, across the Zagros Mountains and out toward the Indus, you enter a region that had already experienced its own kind of unravelling. The great cities of the mature Harappan civilization, Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dholavira, had flourished earlier, during the 3rd millennium BC. They built standardized brick houses, straight streets, elaborate drainage systems, and left behind a still undeciphered script on tiny seals. By the time the Mediterranean was enjoying its late Bronze Age Golden Age, those cities were already fading. The reasons are still debated. Climate shifts that weakened the monsoon and shifted rivers away from their old courses, changing trade patterns, internal social transformations. Whatever the combination, by the 2nd millennium BC, the urban heart of the Indus world had begun to fragment. But this was not an instant collapse into nothing. In what archaeologists call the late Harappan period, many of those sites show signs of continued, if altered, life. Populations shrink. Monumental buildings are abandoned or repurposed. Craft production becomes more localized. The material culture becomes more varied, less standardized. You can almost feel the system breathing out, moving from a tightly integrated urban civilization to a looser patchwork of towns, villages, and regional traditions. By the time the shock waves of 1200 BC were rolling through the Mediterranean, communities in the Indus region were already living in a post-urban world. They too were negotiating droughts, river changes, and new arrivals on their frontiers, groups we later call Indo-Aryan, bringing with them Vedic hymns and different ways of organizing society. The story is not one neat, synchronized global crash. It's more like overlapping circles of disruption, each region on its own timetable, but all feeling some combination of climate stress, population movement, and political fragility. Farther east still, in what is now China, a different drama was unfolding. There, the Shang dynasty had ruled parts of the Yellow River Valley for centuries. They left behind oracle bones inscribed with one of the earliest known Chinese writing systems, bronze ritual vessels of almost eerie sophistication, and a court culture bound closely to divination, sacrifice, and communication with ancestors. Around 1046 BC, just a few generations after the Mediterranean's worst years, the Shang were overthrown. A new house, the Zhou, rose in their place, claiming the mandate of heaven to justify rebellion against a morally compromised dynasty. The Zhou conquest was not a mysterious, undocumented collapse. It was a power shift between elites, remembered in later texts and reflected in changing burial styles and ritual practices. Is this directly connected to the fall of Ugarit, the end of the Hittites, the troubles of Kassite Babylon? We don't know. There is no clay tablet from Hattusa mentioning a king in distant China, no Chinese oracle bone asking about the fate of Troy. These were largely separate worlds, and yet, when you pull back far enough, the global map around 1200 to 1000 BC looks speckled with transition. Dynasties ending, old centres dimming, new ones emerging from the shadows of the old. In the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean, the aftermath felt especially stark. When we talk about a dark age after the Bronze Age collapse, it is not because humans suddenly became less intelligent or less creative. It is because the things that leave bright traces in the archaeological record dimmed or disappeared. Writing, for one. The Linear B script used to keep palace accounts in Mycenaean Greece vanished with the palaces themselves. For roughly 4 centuries the Greeks were effectively non-literate again, at least in the sense of leaving written records we can read. Scribes vanished into silence. Monumental architecture faded. The great fortified palace complexes, Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, were abandoned or reduced to small, irregular settlements. In many areas, population levels fell. People moved into defensible hilltop villages or scattered farmsteads. Large stone buildings gave way to simpler structures in mud brick and timber that do not impress the way cyclopean walls do. Long-distance trade networks frayed. The standardized, wide-ranging exchange of luxury goods, Cypriot copper, Canaanite jars, Egyptian faience, Mycenaean pottery turning up everywhere, dwindled. Some trade survived, but it was patchier, less predictable, more local. The glittering web that had bound Egypt to Cyprus to Ugarit to the Aegean loosened. Threads broke. For later Greeks, looking back centuries from the vantage of Homeric poetry and early city-states, this period between the fall of the palaces and their own age existed as a kind of hazy, half-remembered time of wandering heroes and scattered chieftains. A dark age is sometimes just a time when the lights of bureaucracy and monumental stone go out, and the surviving fires are smaller, closer to the ground. Elsewhere, in regions often skipped in quick summaries, new patterns were quietly taking shape. In Europe, north and west of the old Mycenaean world, communities were already working iron. Where bronze required long chains of trade, tin from one place, copper from another, iron ore was more widely available. It was harder to smelt at first, but once mastered, it made societies less dependent on fragile, distant networks. Around the 12th and 11th centuries BC, we begin to see early Iron Age cultures emerging. Urnfield traditions in Central Europe, for example, with their characteristic cremation burials and broad, interlinked horizons of material culture. These were not civilizations in the palatial Bronze Age sense. No great archives, no monumental stone temples, but they were sophisticated in their own ways. They forged new metal technologies, developed intricate metalwork, and laid the foundations for later peoples the classical world would know by different names. On the Levantine coasts, survivors of the collapse were already pivoting toward the future. Among them were the Phoenicians, city-states like Tyre, Sidon and Byblos, heirs to Canaanite traditions, squeezed for centuries between Egyptian ambitions and inland empires. The destruction of many inland powers and the retreat of Egypt from full control of the coast left them with more room to breathe. They were already accomplished sailors and traders in the late Bronze Age. In the centuries after 1177 BC, as other networks flickered out, their ships began to slip farther and more often across the Mediterranean. At first, they may have been simply reweaving broken trade routes, filling in gaps left by fallen partners. Over time, they would go much farther, west to Cyprus and Sardinia, to Sicily, to North Africa, and eventually beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The alphabet they used, a streamlined consonantal script, would be adopted and adapted by Greeks and others, a quiet legacy of this seafaring world that still shapes the letters you're reading now. So when we say that in 1177 BC every civilization on Earth collapsed at once, that's a poetic oversimplification. Not every state fell, not every city burned. China's Shang fell later. The Harappan cities had crumbled earlier. Assyria and Egypt bent without quite breaking. But across a vast belt of the Old World, from the Atlantic shores and the Aegean islands to the plains of Mesopotamia and beyond, a particular way of living, palace-centered, bronze-driven, plugged into wide, formalized networks of exchange, reached its limits. Some societies vanished into myth and rubble, others shrank, adapted, and waited. And in the quieter corners, in hilltop villages and coastal harbours, in iron-working hamlets and Phoenician docks, people were already experimenting with new answers to an old question: how to build a life in a world where the old certainties had collapsed. When modern historians try to make sense of this long uneven twilight, one name comes up again and again: Eric Cline. Cline is an archaeologist and historian who, a few years ago, pulled together decades of scattered evidence into a slim, unsettling book with a very blunt title, 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed. The title is deliberately sharp. It points to a specific year, a single hinge in time. But the argument inside the book is almost the opposite of that. Cline's central point is that there was no single cause, no lone villain, no one bad year that knocked everything down. It wasn't just the sea peoples, it wasn't just drought, it wasn't just earthquakes, rebellion, or new weapons. It was all of them, layered, interlocked, amplifying each other inside a fragile, overconnected world, a perfect storm. To explain this, Cline borrows an idea from people who study complex systems, ecologists, economists, even engineers trying to understand why bridges fail and power grids go dark. They talk about systems collapse. Imagine again that late Bronze Age world you've been drifting through in your mind. Egypt, Hatti, Mycenae, Ugarit, Cyprus, Assyria, Canaan. Each one has its own rulers, gods and languages, but none of them are truly independent. Copper from here, tin from there, grain from this river valley, timber from that mountain range, horses, slaves, ivory, glass, marriages, alliances, written treaties, expected tribute. Each palace is a node, each trade route a thread, each diplomatic marriage a knot tying the network tighter. For a while, this kind of interdependence is a strength. A bad harvest in one kingdom can be cushioned by imports from another. A local war can be contained by appeals to higher-ranking great kings who don't want the system to tear itself apart. But interdependence has a dark side. If too many parts of the system are stressed at once, the very connections that once stabilized everything can transmit shock instead of absorbing it. You can picture it like a spider web in a windstorm. A gentle breeze makes the web sway, but it holds. A single twig brushing against one edge bends a few strands, but the rest carry the strain. Now imagine a branch falling across the whole thing, or multiple branches from different directions at the same time. There comes a point where the web doesn't bend. It snaps. In the late Bronze Age, those branches came in many forms. Droughts that lasted for decades, turning good farmland into dust. We have pollen records, sediment cores, isotope data from ancient skeletons and stalagmites, all whispering the same story of drying climates around the eastern Mediterranean. Earthquakes along long active fault lines, shaking ports and palaces that had never faced that level of stress before, or had grown complacent behind their fortifications. Raids and invasions, not just from the famous sea peoples, but from hungry neighbours and restless subjects, all given just a little more incentive by the fact that the big powers they once feared were suddenly struggling. Internal unrest, as palace economies that had worked in times of plenty began to fail under scarcity. Officials hoarding supplies, farmers abandoning fields, soldiers going unpaid, trade routes fraying under the pressure of all of this. Ships lost, caravans attacked, contracts unfulfilled. None of these things alone had to be fatal. Egypt had seen famines before and recovered. The Hittites had fought wars for centuries and survived. Cities had burned and been rebuilt. What Cline and others suggest is that this time too many shocks hit too many parts of the system in too short a window. The result wasn't a smooth downward slope. It was a series of lurches, tipping points, dominoes. You can trace one possible chain of cause and effect, like following a crack through glass. A long drought weakens agriculture in inland regions. Harvests shrink. Granaries empty faster than they can be refilled. Famine follows. People on the margins of society, smallholders, landless labourers, those already in debt to the palaces, are hit first and hardest. Some starve quietly, others move. Those who move don't travel as polite traders with sealed letters and proper gifts. They arrive as desperate migrants, or as raiding bands, or as hired soldiers willing to fight for whoever can pay. Those migrants and raiders put pressure on frontier zones, on coastal cities, on any place that still looks like it has food or wealth. The raids make sea travel more dangerous. Merchants hesitate to risk ships and cargo when return on investment is suddenly uncertain. Convoys need more guards, which cost more grain and silver. Trade shrinks, or at least becomes more erratic. Bronze production, which depends on moving copper and tin across long distances, begins to falter. States that relied heavily on imported metals, on foreign timber, on exotic goods to keep their elites happy and their armies armed, find themselves squeezed. They can't pay soldiers with promises forever. They can't repair temples with nothing but prayers. They can't keep scribes copying tablets if they can't feed them. Some kingdoms respond by tightening control, squeezing their own populations for more labour, more taxes, more grain. That, in turn, fuels more discontent, more rebellion, more people dropping out of the official system to fend for themselves. As some states weaken or fall, their refugees become someone else's problem. Ugarit's last letter to the Hittites begging for help becomes Cyprus's incoming tide of displaced people, becomes Egypt's battle against sea peoples at the Nile Delta. The collapse in this vision is not a single event but an unravelling feedback loop. Each failure triggers another. Each refuge becomes, in time, another point of strain. Not everyone agrees with how dramatic or sudden this loop really was. Some scholars argue that the 1177 BC framing makes the process look sharper and more synchronized than it truly was. They point to regions that decline earlier or later, cities that linger on, evidence that in some places the transition was a drawn-out fading rather than a sudden crash. They prefer to see a patchwork of regional crises, climate stress here, political upheaval there, local choices and accidents of history everywhere, rather than a single tightly coupled system failing all at once. In this view, collapse is a convenient label we apply from a distance to what felt, at the time, like an exhausting generational slog of adaptation, conflict and improvisation. Both perspectives can be true at once. On the ground, people would have experienced particular droughts, particular wars, particular kings rising and falling. From far enough away, the patterns line up into something that looks like a coherent phase shift in how human societies were organized around the Eastern Mediterranean. Complicating all of this is another quieter transformation already underway in those same centuries, the rise of iron. Iron was not invented by the survivors of the collapse. Small amounts were worked earlier, sometimes from meteorites, sometimes from rare ores. But during the late Bronze Age it remained marginal, a curiosity, a luxury metal in some contexts. Bronze was still king. Bronze, however, chained you to trade. You needed copper and tin in the right proportions. If you ruled a land with plenty of one and none of the other, you were at the mercy of foreign miners and foreign merchants. That dependence helped keep the palace elites important. They controlled access to the networks that turned rock into weapons, ploughshares and prestige goods. Iron broke that pattern. Iron ore is more common, spread across many landscapes. It is harder to smelt. You need higher temperatures, different techniques, but once those techniques are learned, you are less dependent on a fragile long-distance web. As the Bronze Age palaces faltered, knowledge of iron working began to spread. Not overnight, not in a tidy burst, but gradually, unevenly, seeping from region to region. In the long run, this shift would democratize metal to some extent. Local communities could experiment with iron without asking distant kings for permission, without waiting for a ship to bring tin. An elite whose power rested on their monopoly over bronze production, over access to specific mines and trade deals, suddenly found that monopoly less secure. It is hard to say exactly how much this contributed to the collapse itself. and how much it simply shaped the world that emerged afterward. The evidence is spotty, the timeline's fuzzy, but it's easy to imagine iron as one more subtle stress on an already creaking order, and as one of the reasons the post-collapse world looked so different. And this is perhaps the most haunting part of the story. We're trying to understand a complex, multi-layered catastrophe through a keyhole. Many of the archives that might have explained what happened, palace libraries, temple records, boxes of letters and contracts, burned when the buildings around them did. Clay tablets survive fire better than papyrus or wood, but not all tablets were baked, and not all cities burned in just the right way to preserve them. Whole sites still lie buried under modern towns, farms, or unexplored hillsides. Shipwrecks sleep on seabeds we've not yet scanned. Oral stories that once carried memories of these years have been lost or transformed beyond recognition. What survives are hints. A desperate letter from Ugarit, a burned layer in a Canaanite town, a drying curve in a lake bed, a shift from bronze to iron knives in a graveyard, a name, Sea Peoples, carved by a triumphant Egyptian scribe who did not care to record the other side of the story. Cline's perfect storm is, in the end, a carefully argued reconstruction, not a solved mystery. The Bronze Age collapse remains partly in shadow, its causes overlapping like waves, its timelines blurred, its human experiences mostly unrecorded. Perhaps that is why it is so compelling. You're looking at the dim edge of a disaster big enough to reshape civilizations, but not quite clear enough to pin down. Your mind fills in the missing pieces, imagining the choices, the fears, the ordinary days lived under extraordinary strain. And as you drift towards sleep, you carry with you this image, a glittering, interwoven world, pushed beyond its limits by a tangle of forces it could not quite see coming, and slowly, unevenly giving way. From those ruins, a different world would grow. When the dust finally settled, the map of the Eastern Mediterranean did not look empty. It looked smaller. The great royal names that had once dominated letters and treaties were gone, or reduced to shadows of themselves. No more Great King of Hatti. No more proud Mycenaean monarchs sending chariots and fine oil across the wine-dark sea. Instead, you would have seen clusters, hilltop villages clinging to defensible ridges, modest towns rebuilding inside the blackened shells of old cities, farmsteads pushing into land that had once been monitored, taxed, and counted by palace scribes, and now was simply there for whoever could hold it. Population dropped in some regions, but people didn't vanish. They resorted. Power broke apart into many smaller pieces. Local chiefs, clan heads, small kings with grand titles and very modest resources. The long silk ribbon of international diplomacy frayed into short, knotted strands of regional politics. From a distance, historians call this a dark age. Up close, for the people living through it, it may have felt less like darkness and more like uncertainty. Fewer royal storehouses to fall back on, fewer foreign luxuries, fewer professional armies marching under glittering banners, but also, in some places, fewer tax collectors, fewer forced labour levies, fewer obligations to distant overlords. In that looser, more fragmented landscape, new kinds of players began to move. One of the most surprising of these lived along narrow strips of coast in what we now call Lebanon and northern Israel. We call them the Phoenicians. They were not a single unified kingdom at first, but a chain of independent city-states. Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Arwad, each one with its own king, its own patron gods, its own harbour carved into the rock. During the late Bronze Age, these ports had been minor but useful cogs in the big palace machine, supplying timber from the Lebanon forests, trading purple dye, acting as intermediaries for Egyptian and Hittite demands. After the collapse, With many of the big palaces gone and the old trade routes in ruins, the Phoenician cities found themselves in a strange position. They had ships, they had skilled sailors, they had a tradition of seaborne trade, and suddenly they had very little competition. The old royal fleets of Mycenae and Ugarit were no longer patrolling the sea lanes. The Hittite bureaucracy that had once regulated access to Anatolian metals had vaporized. Egyptian power had pulled back to defend its core. Into that vacuum the Phoenician merchants sailed. At first, they probably moved cautiously along familiar coasts, reknitting broken lines of exchange. Copper here, iron there, timber, wine, oil, glass, luxury goods. They were the ones who figured out how to operate in a world where the old safety nets were gone, small, flexible, opportunistic. Over generations their horizons expanded. We begin to see Phoenician goods, fine ceramics, distinctive amphora, carved ivory, in Cyprus, in the Aegean, in North Africa, in Spain. They founded trading posts and colonies along the way, stepping stones that would eventually become whole new cities. Among these, one would loom especially large in later history: Carthage, on the coast of modern Tunisia. Founded, according to later traditions, by settlers from Tyre, Carthage started as just another Phoenician outpost. Over centuries it would grow into a commercial powerhouse of its own, controlling Western Mediterranean trade, fighting wars with emerging Italian powers, and leaving its own deep mark on the ancient world. But even before Carthage rose, the Phoenicians reshaped something more subtle and more enduring than any city. They refined and spread an alphabet. Late Bronze Age palaces had used complex writing systems: Egyptian hieroglyphs, Mesopotamian cuneiform, the syllabic linear scripts of the Aegean. All of them required long training and specialized scribes. The Phoenician script took a different approach. It broke language down into a small set of consonant signs, 20-odd characters that could be combined and recombined to write almost any word. It was simpler to learn, faster to write, easier to adapt to new tongues. In a world without central palaces to monopolize literacy, that mattered. Merchants, minor officials, even ordinary townspeople could, in principle, use this new tool. As Phoenician sailors carried their wares west, they also carried their letters. Greek traders picked up the system, added vowels, and turned it into the Greek alphabet. The Etruscans adapted that. The Romans adapted the Etruscan version. Centuries later, the letters you're seeing in your mind as you listen trace their lineage back to those Phoenician signs scratched on pots and tablets. While the Phoenicians threaded the seas inland, other new identities were taking shape. In the highlands of Canaan, scattered villages began to appear in the Iron Age whose material culture looks just a little different from their neighbours. Fewer pig bones in the trash pits, distinctive pottery styles, small four-room houses repeated over and over. Over time, those highland communities would come to see themselves, and be seen by others, as Israel. Their origins are debated. Some scholars see them as local Canaanites who reorganized socially and religiously in the wake of the collapse, moving into the hills as lowland city-states fell apart. Others allow for an influx of groups from outside, filtered through later biblical stories of migration and exodus. The truth may be a blend. Old populations reshaped by new ideas and occasional newcomers. What matters for our story is that in a region once dominated by foreign empires, Egyptian garrisons, Hittite diplomacy, Canaanite city kings, small-scale local polities like Israel began to emerge and endure. On the coastal plain, another group was settling in. Archaeology shows a cluster of cities: Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, Gaza, whose pottery, architecture and customs in the early Iron Age look strikingly Aegean. Oven types, decorative styles, Even certain foods and drinking habits point to connections with the world that had once belonged to Mycenaean Greece. Egyptian texts refer to a group called the Peliset among the sea peoples who attack their shores. Many scholars link these two clues and suggest that the Philistines of later biblical fame were, at least in part, descended from those displaced maritime groups. People whose homelands in the Aegean or Anatolia had been disrupted by the same storms that wrecked the Bronze Age palaces, who ended up carving out a new home on the southern Levantine coast. If so, then the wars and rivalries between early Israelite tribes and the Philistine cities, stories that echo faintly in the biblical tales of Samson and of David and Goliath, were not just local squabbles. They were one small corner of the broader reshuffling that followed the collapse. Old elites gone, new peoples arriving, edges of the map turning into centres of new political experiments. Farther to the northwest across the narrow sea, the story took a different shape. In Greece, the fall of the Mycenaean palaces around the same period ushered in centuries often labelled the Greek Dark Ages. The great citadels at Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns burned. Their linear bee-scribes vanished. The massive Tholos tombs with their carved facades were no longer built. Populations in many areas shrank. Settlements moved to more defensible heights. Trade with the East dwindled. For a long time, it looked from the outside as if civilization in Greece had simply stopped. But beneath the silence of lost writing, other processes were at work. Local chiefs ruled from modest hill forts. Oral traditions thrived. Long, memorized poems that would centuries later be written down as the Iliad and the Odyssey, preserving distant memories of a world of palaces and bronze-clad warriors long gone. Slowly, contact with the wider eastern Mediterranean resumed. Phoenician traders arrived, bringing not only goods but the idea of an alphabet. Greek communities adapted it to their language, and after centuries of illiteracy, writing returned in a new, more accessible form. By around the 8th century BC, something new had crystallized: the polis, the Greek city-state. These were not palaces with courts of dependent nobles. They were communities of citizens, defined, of course, in exclusive ways, often limited to free adult males, but still a strikingly different social form. They debated, they voted, they argued in assemblies. Some experiment with tyrants, some with oligarchies, some, in places like Athens, with forms of radical citizen democracy. From those small, contentious, talkative cities would come the philosophical schools, the theatrical traditions, the mathematical and scientific speculations that later ages would file together under classical Greek civilization. It is a strange thought. The ideas that would so deeply shape what we now call the West grew, in part, from the long recovery after a dark age triggered by a systems collapse in the eastern Mediterranean. Threaded through all of this, Phoenician sailors, Israelite highlanders, Philistine settlers, Greek city builders ran the slow, uneven spread of iron. Iron tools and weapons did not instantly make everyone equal. Smelting still required skill, fuel, and infrastructure. Elites still tried to control access to war and to train smiths. But compared to bronze, iron was harder to lock down. You no longer needed secure access to distant tin mines and foreign copper shipments. If your hills held iron ore, and your community learned the right techniques, you could, in time, equip your own farmers with tougher plowshares, your own warriors with serviceable weapons. Power shifted. Instead of a few great kings controlling narrow choke points in the copper and tin trade, you began to see a wider variety of regional powers, each drawing strength from more local resources. In Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia, the Assyrians, hardened and militarized, would eventually build a brutal new empire using iron-armed armies and efficient bureaucracy. In the Levant, small kingdoms, Israel, Judah, Aram, the Phoenician cities, rose and fell, negotiated and resisted as best they could. In Greece, iron weapons became standard kit for citizen soldiers. The hoplites, whose tight formations would dominate battlefields for centuries. Looking back across these centuries, the paradox is hard to miss. Collapse destroys. It burns cities, breaks networks, shatters lives. It pulls down institutions that took generations or even millennia to build. But in doing so, it also clears space. The palace economies that had once monopolized trade and literacy, that had enshrined certain ways of organizing labor and hierarchy, disappeared or were weakened. In the gaps they left, new technologies, new social structures, and new ideas could take root. Alphabetic writing, iron tools, citizen assemblies, small regional kingdoms with distinctive identities, many of the features we associate with the classical world of Greece, Israel, Phoenicia, and later Rome, trace their emergence back to the centuries after 1177 BC. None of this was inevitable. Different accidents, different storms, and the pattern might have looked very different. The people living through those generations had no guarantee that anything stable or better would emerge at all. For them, it was just life. Rebuilding, adapting, seizing opportunity where they could, telling stories about a grander past and a hoped-for future. From our vantage point, drifting on the edge of sleep, the Bronze Age collapse becomes one long, unsettling reminder. Every complex system imagines itself as permanent. The kings of Hatti, the pharaohs of Egypt, the scribes of Ugarit all lived inside a world that felt solid, ordained, eternal. They wrote letters, signed treaties, arranged marriages, confident that the rules they knew would hold. They didn't. The web snapped. The lights went out in the palaces, and in the quiet that followed, in the small fires of village hearths and the creak of new ships along unfamiliar coasts, another world began. Civilizations rise, entangle themselves, and sometimes fall. In the silence afterward, there is loss and grief and fear. But there is also room for new languages, new gods, new kinds of community. Room for experiments no palace would have allowed. Room for people who once lived at the margins to become the center of their own stories. Somewhere, a Phoenician scribe scratched a new alphabet onto a potsherd. Somewhere, a Greek singer shaped old memories into epic verse. Somewhere, a hill farmer in Canaan chose to worship one god instead of many. None of them knew they were living in the afterglow of a collapsed age. They were simply making do, making meaning, making plans. As you let your eyes close and the ancient names blur together, you might hold on to that quiet thought. The Bronze Age world believed it would last forever. Every world does. And yet, when one order ends, in the ashes and the shadows, something else almost always begins. Fragile at first, uncertain, but carrying forward the memory of what was, and the possibility of what might still be. So we come back to the question we started with. In 1177 BC, the great courts of the eastern Mediterranean flickered and went dark. Palaces burned, trade routes frayed, scripts fell silent, and we still don't really know why, not completely. We can sketch the outlines. Drought tightening year after year, earthquakes shuddering along fault lines, famine creeping in at the edges of royal storehouses, sea raiders probing coastlines already weakened by internal unrest. A complicated web of dependencies pulled just a little too tight, and then snapping. But the exact tipping point, the final letter not answered, the final ship that didn't arrive, the final bad harvest that turned worry into panic, that remains out of reach. The Bronze Age collapse sits there in the record like a broken chord. We can hear the echoes, but not the original note. Maybe that is part of what makes it so haunting. It reminds us that even with all our archaeology and texts and models, there are moments in the human story that slip sideways out of focus. Vast systems rise, hum along for centuries, and then fail in ways we can't fully reconstruct. The mystery is not a flaw in the story. It's part of the story. Lying here, easing towards sleep, you might feel that paradox gently settle in. Civilizations are fragile, tied to climate, trade, politics, chance. Yet people inside them are strangely resilient. When the Bronze Age order broke, families still planted fields, patched roofs, told stories to their children. From those small, stubborn acts, whole new worlds eventually formed. Remembering 1177 BC is not about predicting our own future with eerie precision. It's about perspective, about seeing that systems we take for granted are more delicate than they look, and that when they change, the aftermath can be both terrifying and unexpectedly creative. If you've drifted with me this far into the ruins and rebirths of the ancient Mediterranean, and you're still awake enough to hear this, you might gently tap like, or leave a comment, or subscribe so you can wander through more forgotten ages on some other quiet night. If you'd like to share a small human detail in the middle of all these vanished empires, tell us where you're listening from tonight. What city? What country? What little corner of the modern world is your vantage point on these lost ones? And if the deeper past calls to you, the long shadows before history, the prehistoric secrets that shape the humans who later built these palaces, you can explore more at sleepytimehistory.com, where the Sleepy Time History book on those ancient mysteries waits for curious, drowsy minds. For now, let the names, Hatti, Ugarit, Mycenae, Thebes, fade into a soft blur. Imagine the last embers cooling on palace floors, waves rolling against quiet harbours, stars wheeling over new villages that do not yet know they live in the aftermath of an age. Let your breath slow, like the long tide between one civilization and the next. Rest well. Good night.